She followed the law. He abused his power, but this time he picked the wrong one. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Highway 190 just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Danielle Carter, hands resting lightly on the wheel, focused on the road ahead. The hum of her Tesla Model Y was barely noticeable beneath the faint rhythm of an old R&B playlist playing at low volume. She wasn't in a rush. The trip back home was a chance to unwind, clear her mind before another demanding week in the Navy. 20 miles to go. Just enough time to enjoy the last stretch of open road before family laughter and her aunt's famous gumbo welcomed her. Then came the lights, flashing blue and red in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, though she'd done nothing wrong. She flicked on her turn signal, easing over to the shoulder, tires crunching against the loose gravel. 0.48 in a 50. Not even a full 2 miles over. What's this about? She exhaled slowly. Putting the car in park, the officer took his time getting out of the cruiser, his silhouette growing larger in the side mirror as he approached. His walk was slow, deliberate, a little too stiff for a simple traffic stop. Danielle lowered the window, keeping her hands visible. "Good evening, officer." Sergeant Mark Reynolds. His badge and nameplate caught the light as he leaned in slightly. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just that Danielle reached toward the glove box, pausing. "I'm grabbing my registration." Reynolds didn't respond, just watched. She handed over her driver's license first, then the registration. He took them without a glance, staring at her instead. "You in a hurry?" "No, sir." "You always drive that fast?" Danielle frowned. "I was going under the limit." Reynolds' expression didn't change. "Step out of the vehicle." Her pulse jumped. "I'm sorry. What's the reason for that?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "Step out of the car. Now." Something was off. She knew the tone. She'd heard it before, on base, overseas, in situations where men like him expected their authority to go unquestioned. Danielle kept her voice even. "I'd like to know why." Reynolds exhaled sharply, shifting his stance. "Because I said so." "Step out of the vehicle." Danielle clenched her jaw, weighing her options. There was no backup out here. No witnesses except the occasional passing car. She was in full compliance. She knew her rights, but she also knew how quickly things could go sideways. She didn't have the luxury of being right if he decided she was wrong. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, keeping her hands where he could see them. The sun was dipping lower now, turning the sky into streaks of orange and purple. Reynolds took a step closer. His posture shifted, more relaxed now, like he'd won something. "Turn around." Hands on the car. Danielle's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "For what reason?" Suspicious behavior. Her heart pounded. Suspicious. She caught herself, exhaled sharply. "Officer, I don't consent to an unlawful search or seizure." Reynolds smirked. "Ain't unlawful if I got probable cause, which is what?" "Exactly." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I smell marijuana." Danielle's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "I can smell it," he repeated. "You been smoking?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not possible." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, taking another step forward. "You calling me a liar?" The air felt heavier now, the space between them too small. A passing car slowed down, the driver glancing in their direction. Danielle's heart pounded. She had two options: argue, escalate, and risk this turning into something worse, or comply and hope the system would work in her favor later. She took a slow breath, then turned around and placed her hands on the car. She didn't trust him, but she trusted herself. Reynolds grinned, reaching for his cuffs, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. The metal of the Tesla was warm under Danielle's palms as she stood still, hands flat against the car. Her heart pounded, but her face remained neutral. She had nothing to hide. But she also knew that didn't always matter behind her. Sergeant Reynolds adjusted his radio. 10 to 55. Got a possible 10 to 15 here. Possible arrest. Danielle kept her eyes forward. For what? She forced herself to breathe slow and steady as he patted her down. His movements rougher than necessary. You military? His voice was casual, like they were discussing the weather. Danielle hesitated. She didn't like to mention it in situations like this. But lying would only make things worse. Yes, Reynolds hummed. Figures. You people love acting like. You're above the law. Her jaw tightened. You people. She bit the inside of her cheek, keeping her focus. She'd been through enough training to know what he was trying to do. Provoke a reaction. I haven't broken any laws, she said evenly. Reynolds let out a low chuckle. That's so? He suddenly grabbed her wrist, yanking it behind her back before she could react. Cold steel snapped around it. What? Turn around. He spun her by the shoulder and locked the other cuff into place. A fresh wave of anger and disbelief flooded through her. What are you arresting me for? Reynolds tightened the cuffs. Resisting. Her pulse skyrocketed. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I haven't resisted anything. You questioned me. That's resisting. Danielle stared at him, stunned. This wasn't happening. Reynolds smirked. Bet you're real quiet now. Huh? A few cars slowed as they passed. But no one stopped. No one ever stopped. Danielle's throat felt dry. She had dealt with pressure before. Deployments. Tense negotiations. Life or death decisions. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was home. And somehow, it still wasn't safe. Reynolds grabbed her arm, leading her toward his cruiser. You military folks love barking orders. Let's see how you like taking them. Danielle swallowed hard. This is a mistake. Reynolds opened the back door, pushing her inside. Nah, the only mistake is thinking you could talk back to me. The door slammed shut, leaving Danielle in suffocating silence. She glanced out the window as Reynolds walked back to her car, pulling out his phone, probably checking her plates, probably fabricating whatever story he needed to justify this. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that she wasn't just any military officer. She was high-ranking, she had influence, and she knew how the system worked. He thought he was in control. He had no idea what was coming. The cruiser's back seat was stiff and uncomfortable, the air thick with the stale scent of vinyl and sweat. Danielle sat still, her wrists aching against the cold steel of the handcuffs. She wasn't scared, but she was furious. Reynolds drove without saying much. The radio crackled every now and then with dispatch chatter, but he ignored it. She could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, calm, smug, like he had done this before, like he knew he'd get away with it. 15 minutes later, they pulled into East Baton Rouge Parish Jail. Danielle clenched her jaw. This was real. This was happening. The station was small but busy. A few officers milled about inside, typing reports, answering calls. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the stained linoleum floor. Reynolds walked her in like a prize catch. Got myself a loudmouth. Resisting arrest. A younger officer at the desk barely looked up. She armed? Reynolds scoffed. Nah, just a lot of attitude. Danielle took a slow breath. Stay calm. Control the situation. The young officer turned to her. Ma'am, do you have any injuries? A flicker of something in his tone. Hesitation. Maybe even concern. I'm fine, she said. But I'd like to speak with an attorney. Reynolds chuckled as he pulled the cuffs off her wrists. You'll get your call right after processing. Her hands tingled as blood rushed back into them. She flexed her fingers. What am I being charged with? Reynolds leaned in, just a little too close. Resisting and obstruction. Her stomach flipped. Obstruction. He was stacking charges, making sure she'd sit in a cell long enough for it to stick. Move along. He muttered. Nudging her forward. The next hour was humiliating. Mugshot. Fingerprints. Confiscation of personal belongings. They even took her shoelaces. Like she was some kind of threat. The holding cell smelled of sweat and cheap disinfectant. 3 other women were inside, 2 sitting on the bench. Another curled in the corner, dozing. Danielle sat down, staring at the cinder block wall. This is temporary. This is a mistake that will be corrected. She heard Reynolds laughing with another officer outside. Yeah, she thought she was somebody important. Ain't that something? Something inside her burned. She clenched her fists. He had no idea. Danielle took a slow, deep breath and exhaled through her nose. The anger was justified. The frustration, too, but she couldn't let it control her. She needed to focus. She needed her one phone call. She turned to the female officer standing near the cell door. I want to speak with my lawyer. Now. The officer glanced up. Surprised. Danielle didn't waver. I'm invoking my right to legal counsel. Now. The officer hesitated. Then nodded. Sit tight. Reynolds wasn't going to like this. Danielle never saw this coming. And neither did the department. She sat in the holding room, hands clasped together, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion pressing down on her. Hours had passed, but she had finally made her call. And now things were in motion. The sound of a door unlocking snapped her out of her thoughts. A female officer appeared. You made bail. Danielle stood without hesitation. Finally she was led down a long hallway, past empty desks and bulletin boards filled with outdated notices. As they reached the exit, she spotted Commander Anthony Wells, her longtime colleague and legal advisor, waiting. His crisp Navy officer uniform made him stand out in the dimly lit lobby. Danny. He greeted her, his voice calm but firm. You good? She rolled her shoulders, feeling the stiffness in her muscles. I will be. Commander Wells exchanged a look with the officer behind her before turning back to Danielle. We taking this to court? Immediately. 3 weeks later, East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters lined the back row, cameras clicking every few seconds. Danielle sat beside her attorney, her posture composed, but her mind racing. She had seen trials before. She had testified, observed, even assisted in legal proceedings in military courts. But this time, it was personal. Across from her, Sergeant Reynolds sat stiffly, his lawyer whispering in his ear. He looked confident, arrogant. Even Danielle had seen that face before, on men who thought the rules didn't apply to them. The judge, an older black woman with a sharp gaze, adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. Let's get started. Officer Reynolds, you may present your testimony. Reynolds cleared his throat and stood, adjusting his uniform like it gave him more authority. Your Honor. On the evening of June 14th, I conducted a routine traffic stop on the defendant. She was speeding, failed to comply with my requests, and became verbally aggressive. Due to her erratic behavior, I was forced to detain her for my own safety. Danielle's grip tightened on the table. He lied so effortlessly she didn't react. She couldn't. Not yet. Her lawyer, Brian Tate, a sharp and seasoned defense attorney, rose from his chair. Sergeant Reynolds, you stated that my client was speeding. What was her recorded speed? Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second. I didn't get the radar reading, but she was clearly going over the limit. Tate nodded slowly. So no radar confirmation. Got it. He took a few steps closer. You also claimed she was aggressive. Can you specify how? Reynolds straightened. She questioned my authority. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Tate raised an eyebrow. Questioning authority is aggression? Reynolds' jaw tightened. Tate walked back to the defense table. picking up a folder. Let's move on. You also claimed my client resisted arrest and that you smelled marijuana in her vehicle. Do you have body cam footage to support these claims? Reynolds shifted slightly. The body cam was malfunctioning at the time. Tate didn't blink. Malfunctioning? Yes. Tate set the folder down and turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this into evidence. Footage from my client's Tesla dash cam, which recorded the entire incident. The courtroom went silent. Danielle watched as Reynolds' face paled. The truth was about to come out, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Tate handed a flash drive to the bailiff, who walked it over to the judge. She plugged it in, her face unreadable as she glanced at the screen in front of her. Proceed, she said, nodding toward the courtroom monitor. The video played. Danielle's Tesla dash cam had caught everything. The grainy but clear footage showed Reynolds walking up to her car, asking for her license and registration without stating a reason for the stop. His posture was stiff, his tone sharp. Then came the crucial moment. Step out of the vehicle, officer. What's the reason for that? Because I said so. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Danielle kept her eyes on Reynolds, watching as his confidence cracked. Just slightly. The footage continued. It showed Reynolds reaching for her wrist before she even moved. It caught his voice accusing her of resisting when she had remained still. It recorded his smirk when he claimed to smell marijuana, and then the final blow. The audio picked up the exact words Reynolds had laughed about at the station. Yeah. She thought she was somebody important. Ain't that something? Silence. The judge let the video finish before turning to Reynolds. Sergeant, do you have any explanation for what we just saw? Reynolds's face turned red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then glanced at his lawyer. Tate leaned forward. I'll repeat. Your Honor, my client was detained under false pretenses. Officer Reynolds fabricated probable cause, used excessive force, and let's be clear, abused his power, assuming my client had no way to fight back. Danielle didn't smile. This wasn't a victory yet. The judge turned back to Reynolds. You stated under oath that your body cam malfunctioned. That was a lie. Reynolds's lawyer stood. Your Honor, She held up her hand. Sit down. He did. The judge looked back at Reynolds, her tone cool. I strongly advise you to choose your next words carefully. Sergeant. Reynolds swallowed hard. I misremembered certain details. A scoff echoed from somewhere in the crowd. The judge leaned forward. Misremembered? You mean you falsified a police report? Lead under oath? Reynolds's lawyer whispered something urgently. But it was too late. The courtroom had turned against him. Tate stood again. Your Honor, we are requesting all charges against my client be dropped immediately. And we are prepared to file a civil suit for unlawful arrest and emotional distress. The judge nodded. Charges against Miss Carter are dismissed. Danielle finally exhaled. But it wasn't over yet. Because Reynolds wasn't walking away from this, the judge turned to the prosecutor's table. Given the evidence presented today, I strongly recommend an internal investigation into Sergeant Reynolds's history of arrests. This case suggests a pattern of misconduct, and that will not stand in my courtroom, for the first time. Reynolds's face showed something real, fear. Danielle met his eyes. He thought she was powerless. He was wrong. Danielle stepped out of the courthouse into the Louisiana heat. Inhaling deeply, free, but not finished, Commander Wells walks beside her. You handled that well. She gave a small nod, rolling her shoulders, feeling the weight lift just a little. I handled it the way I was trained to. Stay calm, assess, strike when necessary. Tate joined them, looking pleased. It's not over for Reynolds. The department's already under pressure from the media. This case is going to dig up everything he's done before. Danielle glanced at the small crowd of reporters gathering near the steps. Cameras at the ready. Good. Maybe now someone else won't have to go through this. Tate folded his arms. You sure you don't want to speak? She exhaled slowly. Not today. The footage speaks for itself. A few feet away, Reynolds stormed out of the courthouse, his lawyer trailing behind him. His face was tight, furious, but he didn't look at her. He couldn't. His power was gone. The system that had protected him for so long. It had finally turned against him. Danielle turned to Wells. Let's go. I'm ready to put this behind me. He nodded. You heading back to Baton Rouge? She smiled for the first time that day. No, first, I'm getting some gumbo. They walked away, leaving the courthouse, the cameras, and Reynolds in the past where they belonged. But this fight wasn't just hers. How many others had been in her position and hadn't had the resources to fight back? How many stories went unheard? She knew one thing for certain. Her voice mattered. And next time, when someone else found themselves in her position, she'd make sure they had the power to fight back too. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about accountability, about the reality of power and who it gets used against. Danielle had the law, the resources, and still got caught in the system. So what happens to those who don't? This is why awareness matters. Why standing up, documenting, and speaking out matters. Because the truth, it's only powerful if people are willing to listen. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, know your rights. Record everything. And most importantly, don't let them make you believe you don't have power. You do if you believe in holding law enforcement accountable. Share this story. The more people know their rights, the harder it is for abuse to continue unchecked. And if you've ever experienced something like this, your story matters too. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. And never stop fighting for what's right.